Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and we're here today with special guest Colin Campbell, who's here to share with us his new book, Finding the Words, Working Through Profound Loss with Hope and Purpose. So Colin is a writer and director for theater and film. A short film he wrote and directed with his beautiful and talented wife was nominated for an Academy Award. He teaches screenwriting at Chapman University and theater at California State Polytechnical University of Pomona. He has a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and an MFA from Columbia University. So let's welcome to the show, Colin Campbell.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's such an honor to have you here to talk about this book. Can you share a little of your story with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's got a tragic side to it. My wife and I and our two teenage children were driving out to Joshua Tree. It's a beautiful town about 2.5 hours east of Los Angeles. We were going there for a little getaway vacation, and we were struck by a speeding, drunk, and high driver, and our two children were killed in the back seat, Ruby and Hart. Ruby was 17 and Hart was 14. And my wife and I, my wife's name is Gail, we were just, obviously plunged into unimaginable grief and anguish. And I didn't really know how to grieve. My family didn't really have any kind of a culture that taught me about grieving, and so I really leaned very heavily on the Jewish tradition. My wife is Jewish. We raised our kids as Jews, and they were both bar and bat mitzvahed, and we were active in our temple. And so I leaned on the Jewish traditions of mourning, and I found a lot of wisdom there that really helped me. And so I wrote a book about my experiences grieving. And that brings me here to you.
Well, Colin, I am so sorry for your loss. No parent should ever go through what you and your wife went through. I think today's discussion is important because there are so many people that can really identify with your story, and this seems to be a topic that is important for many people right now. In your book, you share about being a father and a teacher and how this was your calling. So how do we redefine ourselves when we're faced with great loss?
Yeah, I think a big important part of grieving is reestablishing our identity, as you said. It's like when we suffer a great loss, it's also changes who we are. I was first and foremost Ruby and Hart's dad. That's how I identified myself. And now that they're dead, how do I go on living? And then how do I understand who I am? So I'm obviously still their father, but they're no longer here. And so there's this adjustment process that I think is so important as we grieve, sort of understanding that reality. And we have to really redefine ourselves and our relationships to almost everybody in our life. Many of my friends are friends of mine because their kids were Ruby and Hart's friends. And so now our relationship is different, right? We're no longer gathering because our kids are hanging out together. It's different. And even in my own family, I was the one that brought Ruby and Hart to Christmas time, and now I'm coming to Christmas just me and Gail. And so everything changes, and it's a journey. I think it's one that we have to sort of lean into in order to understand who we are now.
The subtitle of your book is Working Through Profound Loss with Hope and Purpose. Can you explain a little bit about that for us?
Another, I think, key element of grieving is trying to reconnect to meaning and purpose. I think when we suffer a profound loss, not only is our identity rocked, but also we start to feel like life is meaningless. We've lost our purpose in life. And we haven't, of course, because my sole purpose in life wasn't just to be Ruby and Hart's dad, but that's how it feels. That's how it feels in early grief, especially. And I felt very early on that if I was going to reconnect to meaning and purpose, I was going to have to work at it. I was going to have to actually put myself out there, because there's this impulse to just hide away, right? That life is so painful, and you just want to sit in bed. But actually, sitting in bed doesn't bring solace. It felt to me like I was just sort of marinating in a sense of helplessness. And so I started taking concrete steps, actual actions, to keep myself in life, in the world, as I grieved. It wasn't that I was compartmentalizing my grief. I wasn't trying to box it up and forget about it. I wanted to bring my grief with me as I went back out into the world. And I think that's such an important part of the grieving process, because we're still alive and we want to live a full life. In a way, that's going to honor Ruby and Hart if I live a full life in their honor.
I think they would be very proud of you doing that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So everyone goes through grief and loss at some point in their lives. It's going to happen. But like you, many of us have not been prepared for that. So how do we survive the initial there's the unleashing of our emotions and the events of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're right in that our culture doesn't want to talk about grief. And so there's a lot of a sense of, let's just ignore the person who's grieving and let them just be sad and be on their own. And that was sort of my perception of grief before I lost Ruby and Hart. I thought that you lose someone important to you and you retreat to a sad place, and then when you're better, you come back out again. But I think that's really a misguided idea about grieving. I really think that an important part is having a community, is sharing your grief and your beautiful stories about Ruby and Hart, for example, with your community. And so I think a really helpful step that I took and that my wife Gail took was to try and not let people just write us off and say, oh, we'll wait until they reach out. We're not going to reach out. Gail and I did reach out. We reached out to our friends very early on and told them that actually we don't want to just be by ourselves crying. We want to share our grief and our love of Ruby and Hart. We want to talk about them. We don't want to have it be a taboo subject. And so that really helped our community help us. I think that's a very, again, useful way of approaching early grief, is keeping your community close by.
And I would see where that would benefit other people who are in grief, like their friends, even the parents who maybe don't know how to express it.
Yeah, it's really true that as I write in my book, that loss is like an earthquake. So there's the people at the epicenter of loss, the siblings or the parents or the spouses or the children of the people who died. But then it extends out in rings of devastation. So as you said, Ruby and Hart's friends' parents were also grieving. And so in a way, talking about grief more openly and having events, I call them mourning rituals, but events that the community is invited to share, I think helps everybody. I think that it's really, it's a great way of looking at grief, that it is a community who grieves.
Is this what sets apart your book from other books on grief?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the emphasis on finding the words. A lot of times we were struck how frequently people would say there are no words to us, and in a way, I understand where that's coming from. You don't know what to say, and so there's this phrase that's pretty handy. There are no words, and on one level it's true, but on another level, it's like, well, let's find the words. Let's see if we can talk about what we're experiencing and I find it so much more helpful. So what sets my book apart maybe is that focus on community and actually how you can maintain your community. I was struck very early on going to grief groups that so many of the other people who were there in that circle of mourners talked about how they lost most of their friends and family to grief. And what they meant was that people in their community didn't know how to talk to them and didn't know how to reach out to them. And the grieving people felt so resentful and bitter. It's like the worst thing that's happened in the world has happened to me, and where are all my friends? And of course, their friends were still there. They just didn't know what to say. And it created this rift. And that rift can grow so quickly to result in a grieving person feeling really isolated. And it's sort of like it's a second loss on top of their loss. Not only do they lose their loved one, but they also lost their community. And I don't think that's how it has to go. I think it's really wonderful if you have a community that knows how to talk to the grieving. But if you don't, I feel like in a way it's up to the grievers to reach out to their community and teach them what their needs are in grief.
So what if we have friends that just happen to say the worst thing because they don't know what to say? Are we supposed to kind of train them on what to say would help us, or what would you suggest?
I do. That's exactly what I do suggest. I feel like I have a lot of empathy for people in my community who, as you say the wrong thing, because I would have said the wrong thing for sure, 100%. Because as I said, I didn't know anything about grieving. And so I feel like there's a part of me that wants to get really angry if someone says something that's really upsetting to me, right? Like, how dare they say that? But then I have to sit and think, well, I would have probably said that too. So instead of being angry, can I find it in myself to empathize with where they're coming from and then articulate where I'm coming from? Because more often than not, the people who support me and love me want to learn what my needs are. I think it's really challenging, but also so helpful if you can find the words to share what your needs are in grief to your community.
Often I've heard of people who have lost really dear loved ones get into this place where they feel like life is not worth living. So how do we move beyond that?
Yeah. I think I call it despair in my book, and it's gonna come. There will be, if you've lost someone who's very, very close to you and very meaningful to you, you're going to have those moments of despair. And I talk about it as these things coming in waves. You know, you'll get hit with this wave of despair or this wave of grief. And one thing is that for sure it will what's the word I'm looking for? It comes and goes. It recedes. There you go. There's the word. The waves will recede. So even if you're in the throes of the deepest, darkest despair, I think it helps to know that will pass too. And the other thing that I think is so helpful in those moments of despair is to try and stay engaged in life, even when you don't want to, even when your instinct is tells you, no, I'm not strong enough. I don't want to go out with friends. I don't want to do this activity. I don't want to go to a grief group. You know, I don't want to be out in life. But actually, being out in life and grieving is a way of moving through grief, rather than being stuck in despair. So my book has a number of different actions people can take, even in the very earliest of grief, the most acute stage of grief, to help you stay in life as much as possible. And I think that, you know, finding a sense of meaning and purpose ultimately is what we're all looking for. And it's it's a challenge for anybody, right? What's the meaning and purpose of our lives? But I think the search is what's really important. Is the idea of wanting to pursue a purpose and meaning to your life. That's what's going to pull you out of despair. And it starts with other people. I think you can't just sit home and think, why am I on earth? I think you're always on earth. Your meaning and purpose is going to be found in relation to other people or other creatures. You might find your meaning or purpose to be, animals, or even plants, but it's outside of you. It's outside of yourself. It's helping other people.
Well, thank you for taking the time to go through that. I felt that was such a helpful piece.
Oh, nice.
How are we supposed to use this book? Can you explain a little bit about how it's organized?
Yeah. So it's organized around what I sort of identified as key challenges in grief. And so there's a chapter on rage. There's a chapter on despair. There's a chapter on fear, because grief can be very frightening. It can be very scary to be in the throes of grief. You can feel like you're really, you've lost your mind almost, and you don't know if you're ever going to come back to sanity. It can be very, very terrifying. So that's a chapter. So each chapter is, and holidays are another difficulty for all of us in grief. So each chapter talks about what I think are these challenges, and then specific actions that I took and my wife took to help us through those difficulties. And then each chapter ends with specific actions that a griever could take, and then journaling prompts. Because again, I think being able to articulate our feelings about grief and being able to articulate our needs in grief is so important. And so journals are a great way of us being able to write out in the privacy of our own home and the safety, being able to say whatever we want in our journal. It's a great way to find our footing through grief. So each chapter ends with some journaling prompts as well. And I think that rituals are so helpful. They can be so helpful. So there are private rituals that you just do on your own that help keep you connected to your loved one. And then there are public rituals where you invite your community in. And those are also very helpful in that they help build your community and you grieve together. And also that give you action, something to do, an action to take in your grief. So almost every chapter also includes a ritual that Gail and I performed. And they aren't meant to be copied necessarily, but they're just offered as, here's what we did, and maybe that will spark your imagination and you'll come up with your own rituals.
When we have a loved one that's passed, one of the holidays that we don't want to have is their death day. And so I've always heard it's kind of a mixed bag. We've got some folks that want to be completely alone and not engaging with anybody, and other folks that they're not quite sure what to do. So how can we support people if we're not sure what to do?
Yeah. I think, as you said, everybody has to find out for themselves what feels meaningful to them. I've found in the past that I like to plan an action, something I'm going to do something on the day of their deaths, not like a celebration, obviously, but I find that just sitting at home and being by myself is I don't get a lot of solace from that. It might be what I feel like I want to do because I don't want to face the day. But I find for myself that actually facing the day and marking it by doing something is ultimately more helpful. So I've done different things on the days of their death. The other challenge, though, I find is actually after any major holiday is also very challenging. I find that there's so much anticipatory dread, right? It's like, oh God, here it comes again. And it gets built up in my mind this big challenging day. And when the day actually arrives, it feels like, oh, well, it was in the end just another day, of course. Every day is full of grief. And so that day was just, in a way, a regular day. And then after that holiday, there's a chance of me slipping into more despair, because it was like, wow, I suffered so much and I built this whole day up and I readied myself and I got through it. But so what? Here I am. Here I am still alive without Ruby and Hart. And so I find there's often a post-holiday crash, which surprised me at first, in the first few years, but now I'm not surprised by them. And so now I can prepare for them in a way. And so I find that I crash less now because I know it's coming, if that makes any sense.
It does. It does. And I think being able to plan in the way that you're talking about, is very helpful for a lot of people. Very helpful, because I
Yes.
even know with me, I think about, a loved one that's passed, and I look at that date, and sometimes it's just hard, it's like,
Yeah.
here we go.
Yeah. And it helps. You asked, like, how do we support people on those days? And I always think it feels great when people reach out and they just say, thinking of you and Ruby and Hart and Gail, or they send some kind of a sweet gift, something. Any kind of reaching out from the community, I think helps. I know some people feel like, oh, I don't want to reach out. I don't want to call attention to the day that Ruby and Hart were killed. And it's like, well, I haven't forgotten, guys, right? You're not going to suddenly remind me, oh my gosh, I know it's June 12th, I know. And so if I get a little note on June 12th or June 11th or June 13th, because those days are hard too, it's always appreciated.
Do you find that sometimes people going through grief are just afraid of a few things, afraid of grief and afraid of even crying?
Yes, absolutely. I think especially in early grief, there's that feeling of, if I start to cry, I'll never stop. Because why would I? I mean, Ruby and Hart are dead and they're going to stay dead. And so I start to cry over that. Why would I ever stop crying, right? The situation's not going to change. And that's terrifying. And yet we do stop crying. That's what I learned, is that even when I'm in full keening mode, so not crying, not weeping, but actually keening, it subsides after a while. And it's a scary place to be full of that much despair and then venting it, vocalizing it. But ultimately, I always feel better. Is a strange word to say, but it's true. I feel better after I've cried. I think it's something that we just need to do, and I think growing up, especially maybe as a male growing up in our society, I've always had a hard time crying in public. It just feels like it's not what I'm supposed to do. But we are supposed to cry. I don't want to say supposed to, because then it makes people feel bad if they're not crying. But I think it's helpful. And it's scary. You're absolutely right. But once we start crying, allowing ourselves to cry, it becomes less and less scary. And that's the real true arc of grieving, which is, as we start, it's really terrifying. And the more we grieve, the less terrifying it becomes, and the more we understand that it's just part of life and loss, and we learn to live with it. Yeah. And I really believe that if we want to feel joy and happiness, we have to allow ourselves to feel the pain. In other words, if we numb ourselves from the pain, right? If we try and block off that pain, block off the crying, we're also going to block off joy and happiness as well, because you can't really block off feeling selectively. And so I want to feel all my pain and all my joy. I want to be open to all of it.
I have heard that we only hurt as much as we loved when we lose
Yeah.
somebody. And so if we're in deep pain, it's because we deeply loved the person that that is gone.
Yeah. And I think that can be comforting too. I found it comforting, that it comes from love, that it's not wrong, it's not bad, our feelings. They're proof that our heart still works and that we are loving people. Yeah.
Do you find that sometimes regret and remorse become part of this journey?
Absolutely. Yeah. And guilt. It's very hard. The guilt, survivor guilt. I'm alive and my children aren't. It's so wrong, right? And how can I? Sometimes I think if I have a good day, I'm suffering, I'm grieving, and then finally I have a good day where nice things happened, and I feel okay, and then I feel guilty. How dare I feel okay? How can I be okay? How can I be laughing at a joke? And we have to wrestle with that. Those feelings of guilt and remorse, they don't go away. They don't magically disappear. Just like grief, I feel like we have to find our way to live alongside it, to not let ourselves get trapped in these feelings of guilt. I early on in grief, I could replay the moments over and over in my head of that driving, right? Why couldn't I have avoided that car? I was behind the wheel when our car was hit. And if I had done something differently, it wouldn't have happened, right? If I'd just been driving a little faster or a little slower, we would have missed that woman altogether. She would have missed us. If I had not decided to take that car ride, why didn't I leave an hour earlier? Or why didn't I not leave at all? Or you get trapped in these or what ifs. And that's a terrible place to be trapped because there's no getting out of it in a good way because you can't change the past. And that's part of living with remorse. We have these regrets, but we can't change the past. It happened. So we have to, in a way, I think, let those feelings of remorse hit us and then let them go. Don't get stuck in them. My therapist told me something very wise early on, which was, he said that those feelings of guilt are actually denial. Because while I'm thinking about the what ifs, right, if I'm replaying those events of what I could have done differently to save my kids' lives, I'm kind of living in the past. So I'm living in denial in a way. I'm trapping myself in that night. And denial is not a great place to be. It's not really our friend because it's preventing us from living now in the present. And so that helped me to let go of some of that guilt, or at least to let go of being stuck in that loop, or seeing that loop for what it is, which is it's an act of denial, and it's not helpful in my journey through grief. I want to mourn my kids and their lives. I don't want to focus on their deaths and regret.
It seems a lot of times people take on responsibility that doesn't belong to them. They think, okay, this is all my fault, but that responsibility doesn't really belong to them.
Yeah. Yes. And it's shocking to me how many people take that on. That's so universal. For example, I remember my sister, she told me in anguish, she said, why didn't I call you and tell you not to go to Joshua Tree? And I'm thinking, my sister lives in New Jersey. She's across the country. She didn't even know I was going to Joshua Tree. How could she feel bad about not calling me and telling me not to go to Joshua Tree? She had no idea. And yet she still feels that pang of remorse. I think our brains will literally do anything to find a way to feel like we were at fault, because in a way it gives us a sense of agency. And it's so hard to accept that so many things happen in the world that we are not in control of. So you've lost a loved one and you think, oh, if only I'd done this, if only I'd done that. But actually the reality is we're just not in control. There are things that happen to us and we have to accept that. There's no, true safety in the world. Yeah.
What would you like readers and our listeners to take away from your book?
I think the idea that grief is active and involves our community and is not as mysterious as people make it out to be, and that we all have the strength to face our grief, even though it's terrifying. We can face it and we can endure it, and that living as full a life as possible is really the best way to honor those we've lost. They would want us to have a full and rich life, and one that acknowledges their loss, but still, we're not trying to forget the ones we've lost. We're trying to bring them along with us through life. Yeah, and that there's a path back to meaning and purpose.
Well, Colin, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work and be part of your community?
Oh, well, thank you. So my website, colincampbellauthor.com, is where you can find out about my book and link to me. And then I'm on Instagram as Colin Campbell Writer, and it's Colin was with one L. And I'm actually doing a one-man show about grief, and it's going to be in New York. It's called Grief, a One-Man Shit Show, and there can be information about that at griefaonemanshitshow.com. Yeah.
Well, reading your book really helped me to identify that I have some unresolved grief that I need to deal with. So I found your book to be extremely helpful. And Colin, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you so much, Marianne. This has been wonderful talking with you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Colin. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Finding the Words, Working Through Profound Loss with Hope and Purpose. Finding the Words available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, just ask for them to order it. Remember, support our indie bookstores. Again, if you'd like to connect with Colin, you can at his website at colincampbellauthor.com. Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after this message. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.